Two brothers bought an abandoned barn and decided to take a look inside. What they found there changed everything. Subscribe to the channel, share this video, and watch other stories. The road that led them out of the city seemed to stretch endlessly, winding through neighborhoods that gradually thinned until there was nothing but flat, open fields and the occasional lonely house perched far back from the road. Michael sat behind the wheel, his hands steady but his mind restless. Beside him, James leaned against the passenger seat, his arm draped casually over the open window, the warm wind tousling his short hair. Neither of them spoke much during the drive. They didn't need to. The silence between them was not awkward, but heavy with anticipation. For both of them, this trip felt like something larger than themselves, a leap into the unknown that had been long overdue. Michael had always been the steady one, deliberate and practical, the kind of man who measured twice and cut once, who never liked risks but had learned over time that life often forced him to take them anyway. At 35, with his job at the mechanic's shop recently gone and the noise of the city pressing down on him like a weight, he'd begun to crave space. Not just space to live, but space to breathe, to build something with his own hands that wasn't just fixing someone else's broken engine. James was different. Restless, spontaneous, the kind of man who saw excitement in chaos. At 30, he worked long hours as a courier, crisscrossing the city on foot and by bike, weaving through traffic, always moving. Yet, even he had grown tired of the endless concrete, the late-night sirens, the feeling of being boxed in by walls and streets. When Michael suggested pooling their savings and bidding on a property outside the city, James had agreed instantly, almost recklessly. They had found the listing by chance, scrolling through online auctions late one night when neither of them could sleep. 2 acres of land outside town, as is, with minimal description and no interior photographs, only a grainy satellite image and a brief note stating that the buyer would take full possession upon payment, with no guarantees. The price was absurdly low, suspiciously so, but neither of them could resist. It felt almost too good to be true, but they placed the bid anyway. Against all odds, they won. Now, as they turned onto the final stretch of road, a narrow lane flanked by tall trees and creeping vines, Michael felt his stomach knot with a strange mix of dread and excitement. He glanced at James, who grinned back at him like a man about to dive headfirst into cold water. "This is it," James murmured, as though speaking too loudly might break the spell of it all. When they reached the property, Michael slowed the car to a crawl. The entrance was marked by a gate that had long since rusted in place, its hinges sagging. A faded, private property sign hung crookedly from one chain, the letters barely visible under decades of peeling paint and weather. The land beyond was wild. Untamed grass waist-high in places, tangles of thorny bushes pressing up against a weathered fence, and towering oak trees that loomed along the edges like silent sentinels. It was beautiful in its own harsh, forgotten way, but what caught their attention most was the structure at the center of the property. It stood alone, a lonely silhouette against the tree line, a single, sagging shed of corrugated metal and rotting wood, its roof bowed inward as though exhausted by years of storms. Rust streaked its sides in long red rivulets, and weeds had grown thick around its base, swallowing the lower boards until it looked half buried. Michael parked the car just inside the broken gate, and the two brothers stepped out. The air was different here, still and heavy, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and moss. It was the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, as though even the birds avoided this place. James whistled low, his eyes scanning the overgrown property. "Looks like we've got work cut out for us," he said, his voice breaking the silence. Michael nodded but didn't answer. He couldn't take his eyes off the shed. It was the only thing man made for miles, and yet it looked less like a building and more like an artifact abandoned and swallowed by time. As they approached it, he noticed details that made his skin prickle. Deep scratches etched into the wooden frame of the door, faint but deliberate, almost like symbols, though weather and age had blurred them beyond recognition. The door itself was secured with a rusted padlock, so thickly corroded that it seemed fused shut. The hinges looked brittle enough to snap with a hard push, but Michael didn't move closer yet. Instead, he circled the structure slowly, boots crunching against the dry grass. The walls bore the scars of decades, splintered boards, jagged rust along the edges of the metal roof, windows long since covered with planks. It was as though someone had sealed it deliberately, intending it never to be opened again. James trailed after him, less cautious, peering through gaps in the boards. "Think it's safe?" he asked with a half-smile, but Michael didn't answer. Something about it felt wrong, though he couldn't explain why. It wasn't just the decay or the eerie stillness. It was the sense that this place had a story, and that story had been buried along with it. He drew in a deep breath and stepped back toward the front doors. The lock hung stubbornly in place, dull and heavy, as if guarding whatever lay inside. Michael stared at it for a long moment, feeling that inexplicable pull. Curiosity, yes, but also something deeper, like a thread tugging at a memory he couldn't quite reach. James clapped him on the shoulder, grinning that reckless grin again. "Well," he said, "we didn't drive all this way to stare at a locked door." Michael exhaled slowly, glancing at the trees around them. The wind had stilled entirely, and for a fleeting second, he had the unnerving sense they were being watched, not by anyone, but by the land itself, by the shed looming silently in front of them. He shook it off. Whatever lay behind that door, they would find out. It was, after all, their land now. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the overgrown field, Michael reached for the lock. It was only the beginning, though neither of them could yet imagine just how much their lives were about to change. The rusted padlock gave way far easier than Michael had expected. After a few sharp blows with the heavy wrench they'd brought from the trunk of the car, the corroded metal shattered with a brittle snap, falling into the weeds at their feet. The doors of the shed groaned on their hinges as James gave them a push, the sound harsh and metallic in the oppressive silence of the property. Dust poured out in a wave, carrying the smell of damp wood and mildew, as though the air inside had been trapped for decades. Michael hesitated on the threshold, shining his flashlight into the gloom. His beam cut through a haze of dust motes, illuminating rough wooden walls that were warped and stained from years of neglect. The floor was littered with debris, splintered planks, rusted nails, and scraps of old fabric half-eaten by mice. The air felt stale and heavy, so thick with age that every breath seemed to coat their throats. James stepped in first, unbothered by the smell, his boots crunching against something brittle. Bones, Michael realized with a flicker of unease, but likely animal, perhaps a long-dead raccoon or rat. "Smells like history," James muttered, forcing a laugh that sounded smaller than usual. Michael followed, scanning the interior carefully. It wasn't a large space, but it was cluttered, every corner stacked with remnants of a forgotten past. Tools hung from hooks, their metal heads dulled and eaten away by rust. A broken wheelbarrow leaned against the wall, its wood long rotted through. Shelves bowed under the weight of cracked glass jars, their contents unrecognizable, sealed away in some opaque sludge. But what drew their attention most of all was what sat squarely at the far end of the shed, half buried under a collapsed shelving unit and layers of dust. A massive wooden chest, bound with rusted iron bands and wrapped tightly in a length of chain. Its surface was scarred and pitted, but faintly visible beneath the grime were intricate carvings, the kind of ornate patterns that spoke of craftsmanship from another century. Michael knelt before it, brushing his fingers over the cool wood. Even beneath the dust, it felt solid, stubbornly intact despite all the decay around it. James crouched beside him, his grin flickering. "This," James said, "is either full of treasure or rats." Michael didn't laugh. Something about it made his skin prickle, the sense that it had been waiting, sealed off and untouched longer than either of them had been alive. They worked together to unfasten the chain, each link so corroded that flakes of rust came off in their hands. The metal clattered dully to the floor, and with a shared look, they pried the lid open. It resisted at first, sticking as though fused shut, but eventually, with a groan of strained wood, it lifted. A gust of stale air escaped, carrying with it the smell of old paper and time itself. Inside lay an assortment of objects that seemed to belong in a museum rather than a forgotten shed. Bundles of yellowed papers tied together with frayed string, newspapers so delicate they crumbled at the edges, sepia-toned photographs mounted on stiff cardboard, and, near the bottom, a small wooden box no larger than a shoebox, its surface polished smooth despite the years. Michael reached in first, lifting one of the photographs free. The image was faded but clear enough. A dark-skinned man in a sharply cut suit stood stiffly before a house that no longer existed. A proud woman in a long dress beside him, one hand resting gently on the shoulder of a small girl holding an ornate doll. Their faces bore a striking familiarity that Michael couldn't immediately place, but it tugged at him in a way that felt deep and unsettling. He flipped the photograph over and froze. Scrawled in ink along the back was a name, Isaac Walker. His breath caught. Walker? Her last name. James leaned in, staring over his shoulder. "That's our name," he said quietly, his usual joking tone absent. Michael said nothing, rifling quickly through the other photographs. Each one featured the same family, Isaac, his wife, and their daughter in different settings, standing by an old carriage seated in a parlor filled with elegant furnishings, even at what appeared to be a general store, with Isaac behind the counter. There was pride in the way he stood, a confidence rare for a black man in photographs of that era, one that seemed to speak of wealth and determination. Beneath the photos lay the newspapers. Michael lifted one gingerly, careful not to tear it, and squinted at the headline through the smudged ink. It was dated over a century ago, proclaiming in bold letters, "Local entrepreneur expands timber trade." The article spoke of Isaac Walker, his ownership of several acres of land, including the very plot they now stood on, and his thriving lumber business. Another paper told a different story, its tone darker. Charges filed against Walker, allegations of fraud, rock community. James glanced over Michael's shoulder, frowning. Fraud? Michael turned the page. The details were vague but damning, painting Isaac as a swindler. The article claimed his assets had been seized, his reputation ruined. Yet there was no follow-up, no conclusion to the tale, as if it had simply vanished from public record. At the bottom of the chest was a wooden box. Michael hesitated before opening it, a tremor of anticipation in his fingers. Inside was a single object, a doll, its porcelain face cracked but still eerily intact, dressed in lace now yellowed with age. It was unmistakable. The same doll from the photograph of the little girl. James shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck. "What is all this doing here?" he asked. "Why would this be left in some rotten shed?" Michael didn't answer. Instead, his attention shifted to a folded sheet of heavy paper tucked along the side of the chest. He drew it out and carefully unfurled it across the dusty floorboards. It was a blueprint, meticulously drawn, showing their property as it must have looked a century ago. The shed was marked in precise lines, but beside it was something else, a rectangular outline labeled only as subterranean level. James crouched low, tracing the lines with his finger. "There's something under here," he said. Michael stared at the blueprint, unease mingling with curiosity. Everything about this discovery felt like it had been left for them, like threads of a story pulling them deeper. And the most unsettling part of all was how their family name tied them to it. They stayed in the shed long after the sun had set, sifting through every scrap of paper, every photograph, every fragment of evidence of a life long erased. The wind howled outside, rattling the warped walls, but neither brother paid it any mind. They were piecing together something bigger than themselves, something buried in both history and memory, and, with each clue, the question loomed larger. What else lay hidden beneath their feet? When they finally stepped out into the cold night air, their flashlights cutting thin beams across the overgrown field, Michael clutched the blueprint tightly in his hand. He felt the weight of it in his chest, heavy and insistent. "We need answers," he said, his voice low but certain. James only nodded. The shed loomed behind them, its doors ajar like a mouth left open, and for the first time Michael couldn't shake the feeling that the land itself was watching, waiting for them to take the next step. The night after their discovery in the shed was restless for both brothers. Michael barely slept, his mind spinning with images of the photographs, the doll, and especially the name scrawled on the back of that faded picture. Isaac Walker. It echoed through his thoughts with an uncanny familiarity, a thread of connection he couldn't ignore. James fared no better. He paced the small living room of Michael's apartment long after midnight, muttering theories to himself, alternating between excitement and unease. Neither of them could deny it. Whatever they'd uncovered was no coincidence. By morning, the decision had been made without words. Over stale coffee and silence, they agreed they needed answers, and there was only one place they could think to start: the city archives. The drive there was subdued, a stark contrast to the energy they'd felt driving out to the property only a day before. Michael gripped the wheel tightly, his jaw clenched, while James tapped his foot against the floorboard, restless and impatient. The photographs, the newspapers, and that detailed blueprint had shaken them both in ways they couldn't articulate. When they arrived, the archive building loomed in front of them, a relic of another era. Its stone facade was weathered and imposing, its tall arched windows lined with iron grills that gave it the air of a fortress. Inside, the air was cool and dry, tinged with the smell of old paper and polished wood. Rows of shelves stretched out like corridors, stacked high with bound volumes, ledgers, and brittle yellowed files. There was a stillness to the place that made even the softest sounds, footsteps, the creak of floorboards, the whisper of turning pages, echo faintly, lending it an almost sacred weight. An elderly clerk greeted them at the reception desk, peering over the top of his glasses with mild curiosity as they explained what they were looking for. When Michael mentioned the name Isaac Walker, the man's eyebrows rose slightly, though he said nothing more than, "Records from that far back will be in the historical archive room, down the hall, third door on the left. Inside, the room was lined floor to ceiling with cabinets and heavy wooden tables marked with the wear of decades of researchers. Michael and James split up instinctively, one moving toward the old census records while the other began rifling through boxes of newspapers preserved in plastic sleeves. They worked in silence for hours, their focus unbroken. Each scrap of information they uncovered, pulling them deeper into a past that felt at once alien and intimately personal. Michael was the first to find it, a census record from 1910. He traced his finger along the faded ink until he found the entry. Walker, Isaac, age 43, occupation, lumber merchant, residence, Oak Hollow. His breath caught when he read the names below it. Walker, Sarah, age 39, wife, Walker, Eliza, age 8, daughter. The names were undeniable. He called James over and they stared down at the page together, stunned. "That's them," James said quietly, pointing to the names. "That has to be them." It was proof, but it raised more questions than it answered. Michael flipped to the next census, dated 10 years later, but the Walker family was gone. No forwarding address, no trace. It was as if they had vanished completely from the records after 1910. They dug deeper, turning to the old newspapers, determined to fill in the blanks. The more they read, the more a story began to take shape. A story equal parts inspiring and tragic. Articles from the late 1800s chronicled Isaac Walker's rise as one of the few successful black businessmen in the region. He had purchased acres of timberland, opened a lumber mill, and even supplied materials for the growing town. There were mentions of charity donations, sponsorship of a local school, and speeches he had given advocating education and opportunity. But then, abruptly, the tone of the articles shifted. Headlines accused him of fraud, embezzlement, and other financial crimes. The language was harsh, condemning, and tinged with the racial prejudice of the time. There was no trial coverage, no court records they could find, just an announcement that his property had been seized by creditors and auctioned off. One article, tucked near the back of an old paper, mentioned Isaac's untimely death while incarcerated, offering no details. Another, only a few weeks later, reported on an estate sale where the remaining possessions of the disgraced Walker family were sold to pay debts. After that, silence. No obituary, no mention of Sarah or little Eliza. It was as though the world had conspired to erase them. James slammed the brittle newspaper down on the table, his voice low but furious. "They buried him," he said. "Not just him, his whole damn story. Look at this. He was building something and they destroyed it, and nobody remembered." Michael said nothing, his eyes fixed on a grainy photograph in one of the articles. It was Isaac, standing outside what must have been his lumber mill. His posture was proud, his gaze direct, and though the image was blurred by time, Michael swore he could see something of himself in those features, the same set of the jaw, the same shape of the eyes. They spent the rest of the day chasing down every scrap of information they could find. Property maps confirmed that their newly purchased land had once belonged to Isaac Walker. Deeds showed it had been transferred through several hands in the years following his death, eventually abandoned when development moved closer to town. But the most chilling detail came from an obscure note in the margin of a dusty ledger. Remaining outbuilding marked for demolition delayed due to structural hazards. James read it aloud and looked at Michael. "The shed," he said. By the time they left the archives, dusk had fallen and the city streets glowed orange in the fading light. They walked in silence, their minds full of images of Isaac, Sarah, and Eliza, of the shed standing like a sentinel over their forgotten legacy. Michael gripped the rolled-up blueprint tightly in his hand, feeling its edges dig into his palm. As they drove back, the headlights cutting through the dark, neither brother spoke. Their silence wasn't empty. It was heavy with realization. This wasn't just about land they'd bought by chance. It was about blood, about history, about reclaiming something that had been taken from their family generations ago. When they reached Michael's apartment, they spread the documents and photographs across the kitchen table. James stared at the blueprint again, his finger tracing the outline of the shed and the mysterious subterranean level marked beneath it. "This isn't over," he said. "There's something still down there. I can feel it." Michael nodded. He didn't need convincing. The evidence was all around them, and every instinct in his body told him the same thing. Whatever Isaac Walker had left behind, it was waiting for them under that shed. Outside, the city hummed with distant traffic, but here, in the small pool of light around the table, the world felt smaller, tighter, drawn toward a single point in time and place. They had spent the day unearthing fragments of the past. Now it was time to see what the past had left buried in the earth itself. And as Michael looked down at the photograph of Isaac Walker once more, he felt a strange certainty settle in his chest. This was only the beginning. The next morning was gray and overcast, the sky heavy with low-hanging clouds that seemed to press closer as Michael and James drove back toward the property. Neither of them spoke much during the ride. Their minds were too consumed by what they'd uncovered the day before. The photographs of Isaac Walker and his family lay in a small folder between them, along with the brittle census records and the rolled-up blueprint they had stared at so many times the night before. Each document felt like a breadcrumb leading them deeper into a trail left decades ago, a path only they seemed destined to follow. When they turned onto the narrow road that led to their land, the trees looming overhead seemed darker than usual, their branches knotted and bare despite the season. The wind whistled faintly through them, carrying the scent of damp soil and distant rain. Michael glanced toward the horizon, uneasy but resolute. Today, they weren't simply inspecting their property. They were determined to find whatever lay beneath that shed. The moment they pulled up to the gate and stepped out of the truck, silence enveloped them. The sounds of the city felt a lifetime away. The overgrown grass swayed faintly in the wind, brushing against their legs as they approached the shed, its familiar, sagging form standing unchanged since their last visit. It seemed to watch them, its doors ajar from the day before like an invitation or a warning. Inside, the air was stale and stagnant, the faint smell of rust and mildew thicker now that they knew how long it had been sealed. Dust hung in the light spilling from their flashlights, and their boots echoed softly on the warped floorboards. Michael immediately moved towards the spot where they'd unrolled the blueprint days earlier, his eyes fixed on the ground beneath his feet. Somewhere here, he thought. Somewhere under this rotting wood and dirt, there had to be a way down. James began tapping the floor with the metal end of a crowbar, listening for changes in sound. Each hollow thud made Michael tense with anticipation, but most of the boards returned only dull, solid knocks. They worked methodically, moving across the room inch by inch, until Michael heard it. A different note, faint but unmistakable, a hollow resonance beneath his boot. He froze and motioned for James to stop. "Here," he said quietly. Together, they knelt and cleared away years of dirt and debris. The boards here were different, less warped, their edges tight and deliberate rather than loose or splintering. As Michael brushed away more soil, his fingers struck against something hard. It was a metal ring, rusted but intact, set flush into one of the boards. "Found it," James breathed. They exchanged a glance, their faces pale in the beam of the flashlights, before James grabbed the ring and tugged. The board resisted at first, sealed by time and moisture, but with a sharp creak it came free, revealing another board beneath it, and then another. Slowly they pried them loose, their movements quickening as adrenaline took hold. After removing the final plank, what remained was unmistakable. A hatch, reinforced with iron hinges nearly eaten through by rust. Michael ran his hand over its surface, feeling the coarse grain of the wood beneath his fingertips. There were marks carved into it, shallow, weathered grooves that looked almost like letters, though they were too eroded to read. For a moment, he thought of Isaac himself standing here, carving those lines, sealing this door for reasons lost to time. "Help me with it," he said, gripping the edge. Together, they heaved. The hinges screamed in protest, but the hatch began to lift, splitting the silence with a groan that echoed like thunder. A wave of cold, damp air rose from below, carrying with it the earthy smell of stone and untouched spaces. Michael aimed his flashlight downward, its beam illuminating a wooden ladder descending into darkness. The rungs were old but intact, though the wood glistened faintly with moisture. James peered over his shoulder. "Well," he said, his voice a mix of awe and disbelief, "looks like our blueprint wasn't lying." Michael didn't respond. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared into the void beneath them. Without another word, he swung his legs over the edge and began to climb down. The wood groaned beneath his weight, but it held. The darkness swallowed him quickly, the narrow walls pressing close until his boots touched solid ground. His flashlight swept across the space, and what it revealed made him suck in a breath. He was standing in a room. The space was larger than he'd expected, its stone walls still sturdy after all these years, the ceiling low enough that he had to duck slightly. Dust coated everything like a thick blanket, undisturbed for what felt like lifetimes. There was furniture here, a small table with 2 chairs, their wood warped but upright, a sideboard against the wall, shelves lined with objects that shimmered faintly in the beam of his light. On one wall hung framed photographs nearly identical to those they'd found in the chest above, their glass cracked but their images hauntingly clear. Isaac Walker, his wife Sarah, and their daughter Eliza, smiling faintly in the stoic way of the era. James descended behind him, his boots thudding on the packed earth floor. His flashlight beam joined Michael's, sweeping across the room in astonishment. "This is—" He trailed off, unable to finish. On the table sat a tea set, cups still arranged as though waiting to be used. A faded rug lay beneath their feet, its intricate pattern dulled but still visible. It was as if they had stepped back in time into a room abandoned suddenly and then sealed away, preserved beneath the earth. Michael's gaze drifted toward a painting hung prominently on the far wall. It was large, its canvas yellowed with age, but its subject was unmistakable. Isaac Walker himself, standing proud, his eyes sharp and unyielding. There was something unsettling in the way those painted eyes seemed to follow them, a lifelike quality that sent a shiver down Michael's spine. Then he noticed it. A small piece of paper resting against the frame. He approached cautiously and saw that it was a letter. The ink faded but still legible. He picked it up carefully, holding it under the beam of his flashlight. "To my blood," it began. The words were simple, yet they made Michael's heart pound harder. He read further, his voice low but steady. Isaac wrote of betrayal, of men who had conspired to destroy him, of a legacy stolen and buried. He spoke of hiding away what he could, sealing it beneath the land he had once called his own, hoping that one day his descendants would find it and reclaim what was theirs. Michael's hands trembled slightly as he lowered the letter. This wasn't just a room. It was a message, a bridge reaching across generations, and they had followed it to the end. James stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the painting. "What's behind it?" he asked suddenly. Michael turned to him. "What do you mean?" James pointed. "Look at the corner, the frame. It's chipped, like someone pried it once." They approached the painting together. The chip was subtle but real, the wood splintered at an angle as if it had been shifted before. Carefully, they lifted the heavy frame from its hooks and set it aside. Behind it was the bare stone wall, or so it seemed at first. But then Michael's flashlight caught something, a faint seam, a narrow outline of a recess hidden within the stone. His pulse quickened. He reached forward, pressing against the edge. It resisted at first, but then, with a faint click, a small panel slid open. Inside was a single brass key, tarnished but unmistakably ornate, lying atop a folded envelope sealed in wax. Michael stared at it, his breath shallow. They were closer than ever now. This was what Isaac had wanted them to find. He was sure of it. This was the final step in uncovering the truth buried beneath their family name. As he turned the key over in his hand, James looked around the room, his expression unreadable. "Whatever's down here," he said quietly, "it's not just about gold or land. This is bigger than that. You can feel it." Michael nodded slowly, still staring at the key. He could feel it too. Everything in this room, the photographs, the letter, even the painting, seemed to hum with significance, like threads tying them directly back to the man who had built it all, who had been erased from history. When they climbed back up the ladder and into the light of the shed again, their clothes coated in dust and their hands trembling from what they had seen, Michael felt a clarity unlike anything he'd known before. They weren't finished yet. There was still more hidden here, and now they had the means to uncover it. The hatch closed behind them with a dull thud, sealing the past away once more, but this time they carried part of it with them. The key was warm in Michael's hand, and with it came a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. As they stepped out into the fading daylight, the sky heavy with clouds and the promise of rain, he looked back at the shed one last time. It no longer felt like just a decaying outbuilding on forgotten land. It was a doorway, and they had only just stepped through. The rain began early the next morning. A steady drizzle that slicked the roads and blurred the horizon into a haze of gray. Michael sat at the kitchen table, the brass key lying in front of him on a folded cloth, its worn surface glinting faintly in the dull light coming through the window. He hadn't been able to stop turning it over in his hand since they'd brought it up from the hidden room the night before. Every time he touched it, a strange weight settled in his chest, a feeling that this wasn't just an object, but a tether pulling him closer to something that had been waiting for them all along. James appeared from the bedroom, rubbing his eyes, his expression heavy with fatigue. He glanced at the key and then at Michael. Neither spoke for a moment, but the silence between them felt purposeful rather than empty. Finally, James poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. "We have to go back today," he said. Michael nodded without hesitation. "We're close. I can feel it." The drive back to the property was quiet, broken only by the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers. The rain had left the fields slick with mud, the grass bent low under the weight of water. The shed looked different now, looming against the gray sky with an almost imposing presence. Before, it had been an eyesore, a relic of neglect. Now it felt alive in its own way, holding its secrets close, daring them to step forward. They entered with the familiarity of men who had crossed the threshold enough times to feel its oppressive silence settle naturally around them. Flashlights in hand, they moved straight to the hatch, their boots leaving wet prints on the warped floorboards. When they opened it again, the smell of damp earth and old stone rose up like a breath from the past. The ladder groaned under their weight as they descended into the dim underground room, their beams of light cutting through the still air to illuminate the preserved remnants of another life. The key weighed in Michael's pocket, its edges pressing insistently against his thigh as he walked across the room to the portrait of Isaac they had removed the night before. His gaze swept the walls, lingering on the shelves lined with old books and personal effects before returning to the painting's former place. That letter Isaac had written, "To my blood," still rang in his mind, a reminder that everything here had been intended for someone like him and James to find. It was James who first noticed the cabinet. It stood against the far wall, tall and narrow, its dark wood dulled by time but intact. Its presence was unassuming compared to the portrait and letters, but there was something about it that drew their attention. When James opened one of its drawers, it slid out with unexpected ease, the faint sound of hidden mechanisms clicking beneath the surface. "Listen," he said. Michael stepped closer. James pulled out another drawer, then pushed it shut slowly. Again, that soft, mechanical sound, a muted click from somewhere inside the cabinet's frame. Michael's pulse quickened. "Try closing them in a different order," Michael said, and together they began experimenting, sliding drawers open and shut in various sequences, listening intently each time. After several attempts, there came a deeper, more resonant sound, a latch releasing. The entire cabinet shifted forward slightly, as if nudged from behind by unseen hands. With a shared look of anticipation, they pushed it aside, revealing a narrow recess in the stone wall behind it. Set into the alcove was a heavy iron door, its surface pitted and dark with age, but unmistakably a safe. The ornate keyhole at its center gleamed faintly in the beam of their flashlights as though waiting. Michael reached into his pocket and drew out the brass key. His fingers trembled slightly as he held it up to the lock. It slid in with perfect precision, turning smoothly despite its years of dormancy. A deep metallic clunk echoed through the room, followed by a soft hiss as the door released. When Michael pulled it open, his breath caught. Inside, neatly arranged on wooden shelves, lay an astonishing collection of items. Stacks of leather-bound ledgers, cloth pouches heavy with coins, rolled documents sealed in wax, and in the very center, a small chest wrought from polished oak and bound with brass fittings. The air inside smelled faintly metallic and dry, preserved by the sealed door. James stepped forward, lifting one of the pouches and loosening the drawstring. Gold coins spilled into his hand, their surfaces glinting in the light, each stamped with dates from the late 1800s. His expression was one of disbelief, his fingers running over them as if to confirm they were real. Michael reached for the chest. It wasn't locked, only latched, and when he lifted the lid, a hush settled between them. Inside were documents, deeds, property titles, and legal papers that bore the Walker name in bold script. Some were transfers of land. Others appeared to be contracts and ledgers from Isaac's business dealings. Near the bottom was a thick envelope containing what looked to be bank bonds, worthless now, perhaps, but proof of substantial wealth in his time. And then there was another letter. Its envelope was sealed with red wax, cracked from age. Michael broke it carefully and unfolded the paper. The handwriting was familiar now. Isaac's. "My blood," it began again, and Michael read aloud as James listened in silence. "If you have come this far, then you are of me, and my faith in our name was not misplaced. They sought to strip us bare and scatter us to the wind, but I left this for you so that our story would not be lost. These are the deeds they could not find, the proof they tried to bury, the wealth they feared we would reclaim. Guard it well, for it is yours now, as it should have always been." The words carried both pride and sorrow, a voice speaking across a century. Michael swallowed hard, his hands gripping the paper tightly. James was rifling through the safe, pulling out more of the ledgers. They contained meticulous records of Isaac's business, shipments of lumber, transactions with merchants, even wages paid to his workers. "He was organized," James murmured. "He kept everything. They couldn't erase this." Together, they spent hours cataloging the contents, laying them carefully on the table and photographing them for later. The deeper they dug, the clearer the picture became. Isaac hadn't been a criminal. He'd been framed, stripped of everything because he was a black man who had risen too high in a time and place that refused to tolerate it. When at last they sat back, exhausted but exhilarated, Michael looked around the hidden room one more time. The letter's words echoed in his head. This wasn't just about money or property. It was about restoration, about a name unjustly tarnished and a legacy denied. As they locked the safe once more and returned to the ladder, the rain outside had stopped. The world above seemed brighter, cleaner, as though even the sky acknowledged what they had uncovered below. Back in the shed, they stood in silence for a long moment, the smell of damp wood and earth clinging to them. Michael slipped the key back into his pocket, feeling its weight differently now. It wasn't just a tool anymore, it was a symbol. As they stepped out into the open air, sunlight breaking faintly through the thinning clouds, James turned to him. "We're going to finish this," he said. Michael nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon where their land stretched out, waiting. For the first time since buying it, he didn't see overgrowth and ruin. He saw possibility, and he saw the shadow of Isaac Walker's dreams still lingering in the soil. They would rebuild. Not just the land, but the history that had been stolen. And they would do it in Isaac's name. The days following their discovery in the underground room unfolded in a blur of determination and sleepless nights. Michael and James scarcely spoke of anything else. Every moment not spent at work or traveling back and forth to the property was dedicated to poring over the ledgers, deeds, and letters they had unearthed. Each paper told another piece of Isaac Walker's story, and with every detail they uncovered, their sense of purpose sharpened. It wasn't merely about possession anymore, it was about reclamation. The gold coins and wealth hidden in the safe were tangible rewards, yes, but they were overshadowed by what truly mattered. The undeniable proof that Isaac had been wronged, his name tarnished, and his legacy buried not by time, but by deliberate cruelty. Michael spent hours at the dining table, documents spread out around him like pieces of a puzzle. He meticulously photographed and scanned each one, cross-referencing dates and transactions. James, less patient but equally driven, devoted himself to researching the legal pathways available to them. They consulted with a property lawyer, presenting the deeds as proof of their ancestral claim. Though skeptical at first, the lawyer was persuaded by the thoroughness of the documentation. What had once seemed impossible gradually began to take shape. They could not only secure the land in their name, but also establish a legal narrative confirming their descent from Isaac Walker. Their attorney suggested filing a petition to formally recognize their inheritance and to claim historical ownership of the property. It required affidavits, genealogical tracing, and hours spent digging through additional records to verify connections. But, step by step, the pieces aligned. Old birth certificates, census records, and even handwritten family Bibles passed down through their grandmother's line began to weave together a lineage stretching directly back to Isaac. What astonished them most was realizing how close their family had lived to this truth without ever knowing it. Generations had been kept in the dark, perhaps out of shame imposed from outside, or perhaps because the memory of injustice had been too painful to bear. Word of their discovery began to ripple outward. Their lawyer, impressed by the historical significance, connected them with a local historian who specialized in African American heritage in the region. When she visited the site, descending the ladder into the preserved room beneath the shed, her awe was palpable. "This is extraordinary," she whispered, her voice reverent as her flashlight swept across Isaac's portrait and the letters on the table. "This isn't just your family's story. This is history that belongs to everyone." It was her idea to create a museum. At first, it seemed too ambitious, almost impossible. But as Michael and James walked the property, their boots sinking into the damp earth Isaac himself had once owned, the notion took hold. They could see it in their minds. The shed, restored and reinforced, transformed into an entrance for visitors who would descend into that underground room exactly as they had. The artifacts would be displayed with care. The photographs, the letters, even Isaac's ledgers and contracts. They would tell his story, his rise, his achievements, the injustice he endured, and the way his descendants had finally reclaimed his name. Before they could build, though, they had to restore. The property was still wild and overgrown, the shed leaning precariously, the soil thick with years of neglect. They devoted entire weekends to clearing brush and cutting back weeds, working side by side as they unearthed the bones of Isaac's land. Slowly, the place began to change. They brought in surveyors to mark out boundaries, contractors to assess the structural integrity of the shed, and even volunteers, friends and neighbors curious about their project, to help haul away debris. By late summer, the transformation was underway in earnest. The shed was reinforced with new beams and roofing while preserving its historic appearance, its weathered boards cleaned and treated so they retained their aged character. The interior was carefully restored, the hatch entrance polished but left intact. Below, the underground room was painstakingly cleaned and stabilized. Glass cases were installed to protect the documents and artifacts they had found, while soft lighting was added to illuminate the portrait of Isaac that still commanded the space. All the while, Michael and James worked tirelessly, not just on the land, but on themselves. They gave interviews to local newspapers and historical societies, speaking passionately about Isaac's story and what it meant to them. They explained how he had been erased, how injustice had swallowed his accomplishments, and how their discovery offered a chance to finally set the record straight. Their words resonated, and soon people came forward offering to donate time, funds, and expertise. The gold coins they had uncovered in the safe proved invaluable. After having them appraised and sold through reputable channels, they used the funds to finance the renovations, What remained was invested wisely, with part of it allocated to a foundation they established in Isaac's name, the Walker Fund, dedicated to supporting education and entrepreneurship for young people from underprivileged communities. It was their way of honoring not only his memory but also the spirit of the man he had been, a builder, a dreamer, someone who had dared to rise above his time and paid the price for it. By the following spring, the museum opened its doors. The inaugural day was clear and bright, the kind of morning that seemed touched by Providence. People from the town and beyond gathered, drawn by curiosity and pride. The historian who had first urged them to share Isaac's story stood at the front and spoke eloquently of his importance, of how his life reflected a broader narrative of resilience and erasure, and of how remarkable it was that his own descendants had been the ones to bring it all to light. Michael and James stood side by side as they cut the ribbon, their hands steady despite the tremor of emotion that ran through them. They led the first group of visitors through the shed, down the hatch, into the room that had once been hidden in darkness for over a century. They watched as people stared wide-eyed at the portrait, at the carefully displayed artifacts, at the letter beginning with, "To my blood." Some lingered longer than others, reading every placard, studying every detail, and when they emerged back into the sunlight, their faces bore expressions of awe and reverence. The museum quickly became a beloved landmark. Schools arranged trips to visit it. Teachers using Isaac's story as a lesson in perseverance and the forgotten struggles of Black entrepreneurs in post-Reconstruction America. Tourists came, too, drawn by the blend of local history and the romance of rediscovery. Even those with no personal connection to the Walkers left feeling as though they had glimpsed something intimate and enduring, a triumph over time and injustice. But for Michael and James, the most profound moments came when they stood alone on the property after hours. The house they had built nearby, modeled after designs inspired by the old blueprints, looked out over the land Isaac had once walked. They often found themselves there at dusk, leaning against the porch rail as the sun dipped low, casting the fields in golden light. The air was quiet, broken only by the sound of wind in the grass and the distant hum of crickets. In those moments, they felt his presence, not in any mystical sense, but in the way the land seemed to hum with life again, restored not only in body but in spirit. James would sometimes break the silence with a quiet laugh. "Can you believe this all started with an online auction?" he'd say, shaking his head. Michael would smile faintly, staring out at the horizon. "No," he'd reply, "but maybe it was never really chance. Maybe it was always meant to find its way back to us." Their journey had begun with curiosity, but it ended with purpose. They hadn't just uncovered a hidden room and a forgotten fortune. They had rebuilt a bridge between past and present, binding themselves to a man who had lived, struggled, and dreamed long before they were born. The museum, the foundation, the restored land, all of it was proof that Isaac Walker's name would never be erased again. And as evening settled over their home and the lights of the museum glowed softly in the distance, Michael and James felt something they hadn't known in years, a sense of belonging. What had started as nothing more than a neglected piece of property had become their inheritance, not only of wealth but of identity. The land, the history, the name, it was theirs now, as it had always been meant to be. In that quiet, as the first stars appeared overhead, Michael thought of Isaac's words one last time. "Guard it well, for it is yours now." He smiled, feeling the truth of it resonate deep within him. They would guard it. They would honor it, and they would ensure that the story of Isaac Walker would be told for generations to come. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next stories. Share this video with your friends, and check out our other videos for more incredible stories.